I'll never forget this. She said, your group had the lowest relapse rate of any therapist in the hospital. Now, she was stunned by that because I was the youngest, the least experienced. It was my first year. It was a 200-bed hospital. There were probably 20, 30 therapists there. And I said, it's the art. It's the art. And so that was my sign.
Welcome back to the Poetry Vessel. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Ericha Scott. Ericha, welcome.
It's a delight. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah,
thank you.
I think first, for people who don't know you, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into your profession?
You know, I expected this question. I still wonder where to start. In my 20s, I was a professional artist, taught school and ran a museum, believe it or not, as a curator of exhibits. My first big job after college. Small town, but a real museum, not just a community art center. And I loved it. I loved working with the community and art, creating art exhibit ideas and handling them and setting them up, taking them down. I organized 30 exhibitions in 1 year.
Wow.
And so that's probably my favorite job I've ever had, just about. And then I taught as an assistant to the photographer Jean-Pierre Canel in France, and loved that. And came back and taught photography for a community college for a while. Then I even had a scholarship to start an MFA in photography. But I was at a crossroads. A lot was going right in my life, and some things weren't going as great. Tends to happen to those of us around age 30. We start to question some things. And almost by chance, I overheard by chance, I overheard someone say that they were short a counselor in a rehab, and they were looking for a therapist to fill in. I tugged on this stranger's sleeve and said, I might be interested. She says, well, you have to have a master's degree. Well, I had one in education. And she said a few other things like that. Basically, go away message. And I said, well, I have all that. And so she took my name and number, called me a few days later and said, I didn't know, we already hired someone. So I was like, okay. And I was going through a process of where I was really examining my direction and what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. So I was 30. I wasn't very young, but I was still young. And it sounds corny, I still do this. I was praying for signs and direction. And so she called back 3 days later. But the lady didn't work out, and we'd like you to come in for an interview on Monday. So I didn't even have a resume. I had no experience. I had no courses in counseling psychology, I had, think, one course in psychology. It was like a research course. It wasn't helpful at all. But I did have some of my own healing processes from dysfunctional family systems that I think most of us have. So I went and applied, and they interviewed me for 5.5 hours.
Wow.
And the interview was an open door interview, so anyone in the treatment center, a 200-bed treatment center, could come and ask me any question they wanted. So finally, at the end of 5.5 hours, I said, I'm really glad I wore a business suit with shoulder pads because I'm tired. So they hired me, and I had more benefits than ever and more stability than ever, because the art world, like it can be very unreliable. And I had benefits, which I'd never had. And so I thought, well, I'll try this for a year and see what happens. And pretty soon after I started, I turned to my supervisor and said, like, you want me to do family therapy, but what do I do? Like, I didn't know. And he said, oh, I don't know. You're an artist. Why don't you use art? And I said, well, what would I tell them to draw? And he said, he came up with a directive that was very shamanic. I didn't know at the time. He said, well, tell them to draw their upper world, middle world, and lower world related to their family system and addiction. I said, okay. So I walk in, it was a hotel room for some reason. We must have been holding it in the hotel. And he shoved a box of crayons and paper in my hands, literally, and said, have fun. And so I presented the directive and I was stunned. I remained stunned by what I could see in the art. Now, while interpreting art is not considered reliable or valid, it has become an incredible tool for me.
What do you mean reliable or valid? Sorry.
Because art has so many variables, to say this means that is reductionistic. And humans have so many variables, to say this means that it's too reductionistic and unfair, even because when you analyze someone's art, there's an arrogance, like I know more than you do. That's not how I want to be with clients who are coming to heal. So I use what I see in the art to ask open-ended questions and to ask them to see. And what's beautiful about that is the art is my best co-therapist. It challenges people in a way that they can receive it and they can see it. And sometimes they look and they're like, oh, I never knew that before. Now, part of me sometimes thinks, how did you not know that? You've been in treatment 10 times. No, but we can't see until we can see. And talk therapy works, but some people are more visual. Some people are more kinesthetic. Some people have blocks. Some people have biases against therapy and they go, but they're not really open to it. And the art seems to bypass those defenses. I saw that whole year. It was amazing. So I had people journal writing, painting, drawing, skits, made up, whatever, made up stuff. And thank God for my art background, right? And it wasn't just art, though. I included, like, I had people read their letters out loud or do what we call chair work, which is a form of focused psychodrama, where someone sits in a chair and they respond as if they are a person in their life. And then they sit in their own chair and they have a dialogue.
Can you explain what psychodrama is more generally?
Psychodrama includes more of a community of more people and like the whole therapeutic group. And so I've done that too, and I love that. So at the end of the year, I remember I was praying for signs, and the director approached me in the lobby. I was getting ready to resign. I still resigned. But she said, Ericha, she whispered. I'll never forget this because I finally said, why are we whispering? She said, we just received the results of the outcome studies. And I said, okay. She said, your group had the lowest relapse rate of any therapist in the hospital. Now, she was stunned by that because I was the youngest, the least experienced, right? It was my first year. It was a 200-bed hospital. There were probably 20, 30 therapists there. And I said, it's the art. It's the art. And so that was my sign that I was doing the right thing at the right time. And I did try to go back to the art world, and that the doors kept shutting in the ways that didn't even make sense. And then I was offered a job in another place with one of the top experts, well, probably the top expert in trauma in the country at the time. So I knew that was key to all addiction. And so I studied with her, I worked for her and studied with her for 5.5 years. And I've always used art since the first year.
Hmm.
And I never doubted the power of art because of my own childhood, that I was struggling. We had moved a lot. My mom drank while she was pregnant with me. I was repeating fourth grade. I failed it. And I remember my teacher turning to my mom and saying, she likes art, because I didn't really like much of anything. I was sort of like flat and unhappy. And my mother wasn't great with follow through, but she followed through on this, and it saved my life in many ways. And she hired this beatnik, like pre hippie. I'd never seen anyone like him before. He had a beret, he had a gold earring, he wore jeans and flip flops. I mean, really, no one had long hair in my world at that time. And so I can remember I was probably about 9. I just remember looking up at him like in awe, like he was this strange creature from another planet. And he taught me how to paint and with oils.
Mm.
And I, s- I met with him once a week for at least a year, and maybe I think a year and a half. And by the end of 5th grade, I was reading college level. So I went from failing and repeating a class to reading college level in about what, a year and a half? That's amazing.
That is amazing.
It's amazing.
And it made me think about something that you had said, you'd written, that there are a few words in our language that adequately express pain, and to express emotional or physical pain to another human being, we often rely on metaphor. And I'm wondering what in the art
Oh,
was metaphorical to you that helped kind of break through that as well.
you mean at age 9 or 10? I painted a lot of fruit and trees. So th- I think for me, metaphor is important, but it's also the act of painting.
Mm.
Just doing painting is healing. It helps the brain. Some of it is the bilateral processing. Now, a lot of artists don't use both hands, but you can. Um, I think it's also accessing the right part of the brain, where that's my most skilled part of my brain, is the right side of my brain. I think it was also having something that I was skilled at. It's like, because I was failing everything. And so I have my first painting. Somehow my mom kept it.
You still have it?
Mhm. I do. It's a cornucopia, which is a lovely symbol for someone who in life was feeling a lot of lack. I lived in 3 states by the time I was 9. So for me, a lot of my childhood was moving in loss and being the new kid, always the new kid. And so cornucopia is a symbol of harvest, abundance. What a great symbol as a transition into a different way of being in the world.
So how, I mean, speaking of symbol, how, when you work with patients, that I know you think like symbols can take on like national dimensions or cultural dimensions, but also like individual dimensions. Like, how
Thank
do you
you.
use symbols working with patients?
Um, so sometimes it's not even a symbol so much as a juxtaposition of emphasis. So, for example, if I have someone paint their emotions on their body map, I like to use that a lot because,
Can you explain what a body map is before?
yes. So I use this. I keep thinking I'll become tired of it someday, but not even 40 years of this, almost. Where I trace a person's body, or I have them have someone else trace it, and then I have them paint their life story. And it's a visual life story versus verbal. And so um, people often have some insight. There's a story I have permission to tell, where a woman flew in from the East Coast right after Woolsey fires and was furious because she couldn't seem to find a restaurant they were all burned, or right,
Yeah.
or DoorDash wasn't working, and she was hungry, and she'd had a long, tiresome flight, and she also was very conflicted about being in therapy. Uh, it's funny because sometimes I wonder, why am I not getting more referrals? And then more than a few times, someone comes in and three like interventionists told them, go see Dr. Scott. Like, could you just spread this out a little bit?
Yeah.
But it worked fine. And but she came in my office just furious, and sat down and pretty quickly screamed at me, screamed, I hate art therapy. Like, I hate art therapy. And fortunately started to laugh. I think you're in the wrong place. but I said, okay, so you have some choices now because you paid in advance, and you can waste your time or you can take advantage of it. And you haven't ever done art therapy with me. So I had her do a body map, and uh, it helped. It helped calm her down. And she hadn't even finished it. The next morning, she woke up and for the first time in her life spontaneously wrote a gratitude list with like 30, 40 items on it.
With no
No,
suggestion from you.
from me. No.
Interesting.
Just, and that's what I see art doing. I can't explain how that happens, but it happened.
So on the body map, people are painting into different parts of the body, right?
So they're painting emotions where they hold them in their body, where they hold stress, where trauma may have happened, whether it's surgery or car wreck or physical abuse or sexual abuse. And so then what's brilliant about it is people begin to make connections. So how many women have come to me because I'm an expert in sexual abuse, and they don't connect multiple gynecological surgeries with the fact they were sexually abused as children.
Mm-hmm.
But when they're painting the trauma in their genital region, and then on top of that, they're painting surgeries, they're like, oh, wait, maybe there's a connection here. And I don't have to, very often, I don't have to draw that connection for them. Or sometimes I can say, wonder if there is a connection here. But they make it.
So I'm drawing a parallel because having mentioned metaphor before, and metaphor's bringing what appears disparate into like a unity, but is that happening when they're working on the body map? It's like things that
But with
seem
actual
separate.
real facts, not
Yeah.
just metaphor. But it can also move into metaphor.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's
Okay.
both and.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Both and.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that something that you go by in therapy a lot? Both and? Is that something you try and?
I don't have to force it. I think art is a unifier. You nod like, yeah, I get it. Like,
Yeah.
I know, right? You know it is. And for example, I can write a poem and it helps me see the disparate threads that I may have been missing and weave them together. That's unity. That's integration. I wrote that chapter that you read recently about my mom, and I'd forgiven my mom years and years ago. She and I had even talked about it overtly, and not only forgiven her, feel, I still marvel at this. Sometimes I actually feel like I'm looking in my chest to be sure this is real. Unconditional love for my mother. It's amazing, right? But even with all that work and history and healing, writing the chapter, I developed a whole nother level of compassion for my mother that I never expected. And part of it was I saw how she had been a debutante. She went to one of the better finishing schools in the country. She was married to a man that was an Air Force pilot. And supposedly, legend has it, the family was the largest landowner in the state of Texas. That's beyond wealthy.
Yeah.
And so she traveled a lot. They had an extra farm in Washington State, and it was her dream. And then her fall from grace was so sudden and profound and devastating, and she never really quite recovered. She never recovered her social standing, her sense of self, her financial okayness. None of that came back to her throughout her life, for the rest of her life. And that all happened when she was about 28. And I thought, wow, that's really intense. And I developed a little more respect for her.
Mm. And you only realized that when you wrote about it in another way.
I knew it intellectually. I knew the facts, right? I knew the details, but writing it together kind of helped me see a timeline of how crunched it was. I went, wow. I would have compassion for a client that went through that,
Mm.
right?
Had you written poems about this as well that gave other understandings?
I have written poems about family members. More now that they're deceased. It's like I feel I have a little more freedom to do that. Have I written a poem, did you say, that shows how you get a deeper level of understanding? Is that what you
Yeah, in relation, I mean, it was in relation to your mother. Like, I know you wrote a chapter about it, and I know you work with poetry in your therapy
Right,
too. So I
I
was
do.
wondering if, for specifically you and your relationship with your mother, had you written poems about that as well, or you had just written the chapter which gave you a different understanding?
I wrote the chapter, which is about 20 pages.
Uh,
And I've written other things about my mom. I think I've written poetry about my mother, but I'm not recalling it right
okay,
now.
no worries.
So, yeah. I mean, I've been writing since I was a kid.
Yeah, yeah.
So, yeah, in fact, one of the first nice things a teacher said to me was about a poem I wrote. She entered it in a contest without telling me. So it was very sweet.
Mm.
Yeah.
So how do you use poetry in your therapeutic practice? I know you use some haiku, but I was wondering like how you use that to kind of facilitate the practice.
This is how I describe it when I'm trying to entice clients to write poems because sometimes they don't want to.
Yeah.
So when people come to treatment, we always encourage them to meditate. But see the candle and the flame there? If you ask someone who's newly sober or someone who's been has a problem with gambling or food or sex, they're not able to sit and stare at a flame and calm their brain. It's just it's too chaotic, right? And so I find that asking people to paint and write, especially poems, more than almost anything, that it's a form of meditation, but it keeps them busy and engaged. And I've actually taught haiku to Andrew Wiles' associate fellows in his program for the Center for Integrative Medicine at the University of Arizona. Just like my clients in rehab, they're there counting on their fingers to write a haiku poem, counting the syllables. And the feedback from them is just as profound. Like one woman said, I can't even understand how writing a poem helped my marriage. Or, I mean, it helps people go touch their subconscious. So you mentioned metaphor and symbol and image. So I think our subconscious speaks in image and also symbol and metaphor.
Mm.
So if you want to include that in the therapy healing process, then the creative arts and poetry and writing have to be part of it. Not everyone, behavioralists don't think you need the subconscious, but I think you can try to make someone behave a certain way until the cows come home late. um, and it won't happen if there's resistance from the subconscious.
Mm.
I think we have to have some agreement.
Like you need to enact like an inner change more than just kind of almost like a veneer to behavioral change.
If your subconscious is, for whatever reason, and it could be maybe even a childhood trauma, has a resistance to change, it it can happen, but I don't think it's sustainable.
Are there types of people that art therapy and poetry therapy aren't useful for?
I'm biased, so I can't tell you other than my biased opinion. Just like talk therapy, you adapt it for any population. So people are like, "Oh, art therapy is not good for this group." I said, "Who says? Would you say talk therapy is not good for that group?" So where is that bias coming from? A lot of it, and even sometimes people who are art therapists are like, "I can't make my clients do art therapy." It's like, then you need to do more art. If you can't, if your clients aren't feeling invited. One time, a medical doctor, actually a nurse practitioner, which is, they prescribe, came up to me after a lecture on art therapy, and he was so serious. He was like a serious little boy. He goes, um, like, how do you make people do art therapy? Like, and I laughed, and I didn't know he was in the medical profession. And I said, "It's an invitation, not a prescription." And he said, "How'd you know I was a medical doctor?" I said, I didn't." So it's an invitation. And often I say, well, like, sometimes people bring me the hardest clients. And so they've been to rehab 10, 20 times. It breaks my heart because most people don't live long enough to be in rehab that many times. And it's an indication of how badly we are failing. And so I say, we've tried everything else. So why don't we try something different? See what happens. So not long ago, I had a man do a body map, and he portrayed love, which was and anger and anxiety. And um, he looked at his body map and he said, "You know, my love is really diffuse. My anger is really consolidated. That's really sad." And I said, "That's really sad." It changed him.
Yeah.
Yeah. So people, it gives people a chance to go where they need to go. And if I can stay out of the way as much as I can and let the process guide them, with the art, they get there pretty quickly
Mm.
without a lot of detours.
And I found it important, like how you were speaking about it with the nurse practitioner and using language carefully. As you said, make or
Uh-huh.
invite. And
Uh-huh.
make is you're doing this to someone. And I'm guessing if someone is trying to make me be creative, I'm going to resist it and move away. And it, like you said, if someone kind of opens up the
Mhm.
space and invites you to do it and makes
Mhm.
it more like
Mhm.
this is an area where you can just go for it, and you go,
Yeah,
okay, because you already got barriers against art without needing pressure.
exactly. And again, people that have a hard time having people become engaged, they're not doing enough of that. Practitioner's not doing enough of their own writing or painting or sculpting. And we're all guilty of it because we're busy or bored or tired or isolated. Those are exactly the reasons we should be doing more art, but sometimes those are the reasons that we don't.
Mm.
So,
Mm.
yeah.
You said somewhere that you walk the fine line between mysticism and then kind of like
Evidence-based
evident. That's it.
psychotherapy.
Yeah. What do you mean by that? What's mysticism to you in that context?
So it means a lot of different things. Uh, for me, it means that even this morning, I prayed on my knees and I pray from a place of surrender. Um, I have tried to direct my life. It's never gone the way I thought it should. And so I find that when I pray to just show me the signs, then I tend to be more in harmony with a higher source. And my clients tend to do better. So I pray for direction. I pray for signs and I pray to read the signs correctly and try not to squash me in the, in the process of sending signs. Sometimes I'm a little dense, so I don't, I'm hoping I don't want it, you know, like the hand of God to go. Sometimes it feels like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
So um, I find when I engage in that process, and then I also invoke, I'm a Reiki master, so I invoke the symbols. Um, so those kind of journal writing and processes of going deep within, but also beyond me.
Mm.
And so it's one reason I went to Egypt 2 years ago, or back to a place in southern France that has a legend myth that Mary Magdalene was there. I don't know, but I'd like to go visit holy places and like to hear um, discussions about, say, the mother goddess,
Hmm. Hmm.
which is in so many traditions. Um, so, so for me, it is also a belief in the paranormal. Because yes, I was healed at 9 and 10, but it still was almost on the edge of paranormal, right?
Mm.
I mean, it's so extraordinary. And then I've seen art create paranormal. I've had clients come in, spontaneously drop into a past life. Sometimes I'm gulping, thinking, oh God, like, what would the licensing board think about this? And then I get a hold of myself and say, tell me more. Tell me more about that. Like, what happened in your past life that's connected to this issue? And so it happened through a drawing that was about pain that this person had had since about age 3, a brutal trauma. And we'd done a lot of work on all that. And so um, I looked at the symbols. I try not to interpret, but this time I said, those swords going down your legs, they look medieval. And she was sitting on the floor with the artwork kind of in between her legs. She goes, that's my first life. This is my 11th life. I was like, oh. So we processed it. I said, tell me about your first life. What was that like? And so we processed that. I asked a few more questions. Um, and we did some kind of, for a while, I did something called the Brazilian White Table with a group of women, very skilled shamans. I did not profess to be that, but I was honored to be part of their circle where we did healing work for the community. I should invite them here actually right now. They're from Arizona. And so I learned some techniques with that about how to be present for lost souls and how to take care of them and help them come to a place of peace.
What do you mean by lost souls?
So maybe this is their mythology. So um, I think there's an element of truth to it, as with a lot of mythology. It can't be proven, but there's some universal truths. That's why Jung loved studying the indigenous people. Um, so their idea is that souls are supposed to go to a higher realm after they die, but for whatever reason, maybe they weren't. They didn't expect to die. It was a sudden death. It was a brutal death. It separated them from a beloved. And instead of going to the light, for example, or to a higher realm of consciousness, they kind of hang around here, lost and not happy, and maybe with some kind of out of touch with reality. So we helped her first life self go to the light. And that's a weird way to do it, but it's what made sense at the time. And her pain of her whole life went away and it's not returned years later.
So is this like honoring the mythological backdrop of the individual you're talking to?
Right. So just going with what comes up for her, what she presents without judgment. So many times I've watched even licensed therapists argue with a client. Like one time in a treatment center, like a client's sibling popped up and said, "I need to be here. I need to come here." And the family therapist said, "No, you don't." I said, "Wait a minute. Wait. Why do you think you need to be here?" Right? So
It's the open-ended questions again. Yeah.
tell us, like, so that we all have our family systems stuff. And it's one reason I love working with a team when I can. I'm thrilled because just recently I've been invited by Janelle Mays and The Point to be their expert consultant for trauma and dissociative identity disorder. And she's created an amazing team of clinicians at The Point. And I feel like I found a clinical home. It's really fun. It's delightful. So, and it's been a long time since I've found a group like that. And they're doing really, really good work, really solid work.
Mm.
So,
And what will you be doing with them?
so some training and teaching and consulting. I've already been doing some of that. Uh, More informal, it's becoming more formalized, my role. And then what they have done and plan to continue doing is sending clients to work with me in my office so we can do the really deep work while they're still in rehab. And then I feel better because I know they're safe. And they have a driver drive them to my office and pick them up. So no matter what comes up, they're in the right place
Mm.
to deal with it.
Great. I noticed you did something earlier and I wanted to mention it. When you said subconscious, you pointed to your chest.
To my heart.
Yeah,
Yeah,
to
I
your heart.
did, didn't I?
Why was that?
I don't know. Seems to go together somehow. I mean, there are things we can't know, and there are many different theories, and everybody has their own idea. I don't want to put mine onto somebody else's, but that's where it feels my subconscious is connected. The Egyptians thought your heart was your brain.
Mm.
And now we find, because of the work of Candace Pert from Yale or Harvard, I'm not sure, an Ivy League school, um, that we do have neurons in our belly and our heart. So they weren't entirely wrong.
Mm.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Um, I know you brought a poem with you to read.
Oh,
Would you be willing to share that?
yeah. So this one I wrote in November of 22, and it's a poem about a beloved childhood friend that I've known since I was little. I think I said earlier we moved a lot. And so there are times I've lost track of friends over the moves because different states and different churches and different doctors and different schools. But Andy is one that I was able to keep in touch with through all that. And then I moved a lot as an adult too. So this is called very simply COVID Death Poem. The edge of the cliff is obscured by a white curtain of fog, dense rather than translucent. Never mind, I've seen it before. One could imagine jumping into a soft, luminous pillow of diffuse light, floating in relative time gently, instead of falling onto unforgiving rocks. The one who falls has a different sense of time than those of us who watch. I read your pale skin with the fingers of my mind, counting the pulse in the web of your small veins. Across a continent, touch caught like a snag on smooth silk. I feel a crack, imperceptible almost, in your cells, your core being. Why didn't you tell us you were so tired? I learned of this dangerous crevice, the one you fell into, only in hindsight, once the fog receded and you were no longer standing there on the bluff, empty. It is and I am. My pendulum swings back and forth, yes or no, or I don't know. Too late, too late, too late. Partial sound bites wake me from a deep sleep. Someone is spinning the radio dial too fast. I can't make sense of it, the fragmented gibberish of your death. Once again, I'm an outsider, bystander, observer, unimportant and insignificant in the schema of close connections. Yet, distance does not protect me like I used to think. I feel bereft and less secure in the world without you in it. Your gifts of service were vast, humble, kind, and generous. I will always look for you on the flat top of the bluff. I think of you during the moon's eclipse and your rebirth somewhere else. I grieve what is not just and right in the world.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask, like, how long after your friend passing did you write the poem?
I'm not sure,
Okay.
but I think it was pretty quickly because I believe he died in November.
Okay.
So it's a little bit of a blog. I mean, a blog and a fog.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's interesting. I was writing about fog and
Yeah. So I was
fog.
thinking that.
Yeah. So we lost a lot of people during the pandemic. So yeah.
And did this change your relationship to the grieving through writing?
No, I think it connects me to my grieving, which is important because we're all busy and distracted. Social media, news, climate change. I mean, we've just gone through a horrible disaster here. Like,
Yeah.
like life-changing. I mean, it's probably one of the worst disasters I've ever been through. And we were fortunate that we were spared, but we also, as bystanders, are traumatized.
Hmm.
Sometimes, I don't think in this case because the devastation was so great, but in some cases, the bystander suffers more than the person going through the trauma because when you're going through trauma, you have certain mechanisms that kick in that protect you, like dissociation. But bystanders don't always have that protection kick in. So they sometimes, like siblings sometimes, feel it more and the impact is greater sometimes in ways that don't make sense, but they do, but not always for the people involved. Um, Sometimes the observing sibling is more traumatized than the child hurt.
I have a question on the word trauma. Like, how do you define it, and how is it spotted that something traumatic has happened, or that someone has trauma or has experienced trauma?
So first of all, there's a huge scale or spectrum of trauma. I like a work by Judith Viorst, Necessary Losses, because she talks about all the little stages of growth and development and all that we have to let go of to reach the new stages of growth and development, and how those little letting go, that letting go of earlier stages of life can be traumatic. And it sounds corny and it sounds inflated, but if you add it up, it speaks to us. I've had clients who were put in my group at Sierra Tucson, for example, a trauma group. I don't belong here. I don't have any trauma, And then I'll ask them to do some exercise, like a timeline of their life. And I'm like, I just like sometimes want to go like, oh, it's so sometimes a whole bunch of little traumas are as impactful than one huge trauma. And I remember one time a client was, no, there's no trauma, there's no trauma, there's no trauma. But growing up in a ranching community in the West with like 15 kids, I'm exaggerating a little, and, hunting before you can almost walk, and horses stampeding, and, trauma happens. Trauma doesn't mean abuse, it just means wound. Now, that's from the Greek root. So who hasn't had a wounding, even if it's just a bad teacher? We've all had that. And it may seem insignificant, but I see it in art therapy all the time when people are reluctant to do art therapy. Like, so tell me about your bad art teacher that shamed you. I was shamed. I couldn't hear. I have a hearing loss, and I couldn't hear as a child, and I didn't hear some directions for coloring in a cartoon or something. And the teacher used my drawing as an example about not listening. She forgot to say not hearing. and and I remember feeling mortified. I wanted to crawl under the table. I was so embarrassed. And I could see why her directions would have been a good idea in hindsight. I was like, oh yeah, that's really dumb. It's really doesn't look good at all. And so we say those little things don't matter as part of life. And yet, depending on the timing and the vulnerability of the child, or how great of an authoritarian the person causing the slight, like in their role of authority, so a small thing can have meaning. And I see it with people not wanting to do art therapy when it doesn't make any sense. But if we explore their history, often there's a bad art teacher or a parent who went, that doesn't look like a dog. Like kids' art isn't supposed to look like something for a long time. So it's very important to their neural development to scribble and to keep scribbling as long as they need to scribble. So, yeah.
So I was thinking a bit in terms of metaphor, but like there's like soccer football players, when they head the ball, even with low impact, over time it creates brain trauma. So is that like a kind of good way of thinking of it in the psychological way?
Physical example.
Yeah.
And it also speaks to our denial. So, oh, it's fun to butt your head against the ball. It's like a soft rubber ball. And like we don't think sometimes in cumulative terms. Of Alice Miller's work and her writing about for your own good, she's saying that facetiously, that trauma is framed as making you tougher. But childhood trauma doesn't make you tougher. It makes you more defensive in a myriad of ways, but it doesn't make you tougher. So there still remains a tremendous amount of mythology, a different kind of myth around child rearing and what's healthy. And then I like what Terry Kellogg says. He talks about, abused children become parents, and then you go visit them and they're sitting there unperturbed while their kids are climbing the walls and crawling all over them and screaming like banshees. And what they don't understand is by setting no limits, they're raising their parents, like people who will act like their parents do. And so see how it's kind of like an ebb and flow of too rigid to the point of abuse. And then they grow up and they kind of do a flip, like 180 degrees opposite.
So they're like, I really don't want to be like my parents, therefore I'll do the opposite, therefore back they come.
And so what he used to say all the time is the opposite of sick is still sick. Still, we need to have, and that's why we need some healthy mentor, someone we admire the way they're living their lives, or a skilled therapist, or a really good minister. We need to kind of bounce some ideas off because we're making these decisions as adults from our wounded child self instead of and understandable. And I've done it myself. We all do it, where we think we're making really good decisions, but with unhealed trauma, it can tweak or twist our logic. That makes sense, right?
It does. And for it to heal, I guess it's different in everyone, but is it like you need to realize it and then you need to change your relationship to it to let it go? Is there like a kind of process that it follows?
I think by now you know I'm not very linear, right?
Yeah.
Or sequential, or like, so I find that if I trust the client's subconscious, what comes up when it's supposed to, when it needs to, pretty quickly. And it sounds so namby-pamby, I know, but I mean, in 2 different treatment centers, my clients had the best results of any other therapist. That's not an accident. Maybe one time would have been an accident, but the second time, 20 years later, I don't think it's an accident.
There's rhyme.
There's some connection, and I'm the only one. So, and the art, because I always used art. So I think, for example, it's tragic we've taken art out of the schools on so many levels, but I even think we weren't doing enough art before then. So for example, in my group, we didn't have clients go do art 1 hour a week. It was embedded in almost every activity I had them do for my group. So they were doing art almost every day in one way or another. So whether it's creative writing, poetry writing, painting, drawing, sand play therapy, I had them engaged in a kinesthetic way in the psychodrama, which includes kinesthetic and role play, and so every single day in treatment, even more than the first time when I had no experience, they were painting, drawing, writing, autobiography, you name it. They had, and so I think it was Otto Rank. I hope I have his name. I think said keep their hands busy, and Jung said that the hands will solve the problems that the mind cannot solve. If you think about it, have you ever seen those diagrams trying to show us like how large the part of the brain the hands occupy?
Oh, like
Or the eyes?
what are they called? Not homunculus,
Yes,
or
yes,
is
yes,
that?
yes,
Yeah,
yes,
okay, yeah, I know.
yes,
Yeah, I know it.
yes.
They got the giant hands.
Yeah. Right? And so there's several versions of it, like for sensory motor versus, I don't know. But so the eyes, the hands occupy a large portion of our brain. Why are we not engaging as much of the brain as possible? And research out of education, in my opinion, is applicable, which is if you're trying to teach a subject to maybe a disadvantaged group that needs more repetition, then the more of the senses you involve in the education, the more they're going to remember what you're teaching. That's true for any population. So you engage the visual, the tactile, the verbal, the audio, as much as you can in one learning experience.
And scent too, the olfactory.
All of it.
Isn't that linked to
I
memory
mean, we don't use
closest?
that very much, but that could be, why not? I would figure out a way.
So I was thinking, when you're talking about visual and tactile, it's like let's say we're watching TV, obviously we're using visual, but we're not doing much with it. It's just kind of like it's coming this way. And
we're
then
not,
there's very little
yeah,
tactile, right?
and we're not, it's a very, I think, when we're watching TV, we're in a very receptive mode, as opposed to being engaged and participatory, which means we're not filtering as much as we should.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, was Rob Becker, the comedian, he wrote and performed a monologue defending the caveman. He was an anthropologist. He wrote this delightful comedy about gender differences. It's very compassionate for everyone, hysterical. But he'd say, so when my wife calls my name and she wants my attention, I'm watching TV. What she doesn't understand is that I have become the TV. And so she has to keep calling my name because I've become the TV and I have to pull myself out of the TV to answer her question.
Does that go with, I mean, it's like a kind of entrancement. I was listening to
Yes,
someone, I think it was John Vervaeke, talking about video games as they're basically stimulate like an artificial flow state. So you can get into flow, but once you finished out that flow state, you haven't really accomplished
no, and
anything.
you don't feel satisfied.
So it's like a kind of flow state in that it's giving you that, but it's not
Set up.
coming to something.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you're still wanting, and then they're right there. Here's another game.
Yeah.
And
So play again.
Only $10 more.
Mm.
Yeah, it's very brilliant.
And gambling works. I mean, I know that in like a casino that they block out the sun, they'll bring you like food and drink, and you're basically disoriented in flow with potential of high reward and occasional reward, and you just kind of
Yeah.
yeah.
Right. Sometimes with gambling, it's the only addiction where I've heard from people who teach and train that they recommend a divorce because someone can lose everything you have overnight. Your house, your home, your cars, you can be wiped out in one night. And so they're not suggesting a separation. They're saying a separation of finance.
Yeah.
And the only way you can do that is divorce.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So, Ericha, could you tell us about your books that you have here? And we'll start with that one.
So let me clarify. These are collectives. These are anthologies. And so I'm one of 20, 25 authors in the book. But I'm so grateful to Kate Butler because she makes it fun. And I've been in 4 or 5 of her books. Every single book has managed to achieve #1 international Amazon bestseller. I participate partly because of the structure and the support and the encouragement. So she's really good at that. And she helps me think about since I'm not very linear or sequential, sometimes there are too many ideas.
I understand that.
I thought you might relate to that. And so she helps me narrow it down and crystallize it a little bit. So in this book, Moments That Matter, is probably one of my favorites of the books that I've been in. And she very kindly made me a featured author in this book. And so, and Kate, by the way, is a protege of Jack Canfield, the Chicken Soup for the Soul series. So this one is an expansion of a smaller article I published for the Sober World called Gratitude in Times of Despair. And the subtitle is Paradoxes for Wholeness. So you attended my workshop.
I did.
And you attended, okay. And so I'm speaking off scene. The and the idea that embracing paradoxes is more healing than just positive thinking and holding the full spectrum of an experience, the positive and the negative, and working on that together. So that's what this chapter is about, is how to embrace a paradox fully. And, I just start with this one paragraph or two. It's easy to feel gratitude or thankfulness when life circumstances go our way. When it's fun to celebrate, for example, a new job or a promotion, a new or rekindled romance, financial windfalls, graduations or retirement, and recognition for our natural talents or hard work. It's much more difficult to feel gratitude when we're challenged with relational strife, grief and loss, trauma, abuse, addiction, illness, poverty, or alienation. And so I go on to talk about how I've learned the power of gratitude by watching my clients as they work through trauma. And then it opens up space for them to feel gratitude. It's like watching a birth. It's beautiful. It's like a spiritual birth. It's beautiful to watch.
Yeah.
I speak also in another, I think I've written about this, how obviously therapy has to be all about the client and not the therapist. At the same time, who could not be inspired by watching something like that? Like it reminds me that in spite of all the strife people endure, that new life can emerge, and no matter what age. So that's a little bit about what paradoxes are
Yeah.
about. It's it's almost like diffusing the intensity or the energy of a bomb. And when you diffuse it, then new life just jumps in.
Mm.
It happens automatically. I don't have to orchestrate it. It just happens.
And it also comes out in poetry, and it came out in your poem. Like, one of the things that you're talking about was nearness and distance, and you're kind of using those opposite
Yes.
tensions that help us work through something. So I noticed paradox come up
Beautiful.
there as well.
Beautiful example. Thank you.
Yeah.
So,
And the other book.
okay, so this one was just released last week.
Oh, there we go.
And so it's new. So this chapter, I'll admit, I'm trying to hold the paradox of this chapter. I'm really glad I wrote it. And I had a little bit of a disclosure reaction after I wrote it on the day that it was launching, on launch day, which was the
disclosure reaction. What's that?
So in this chapter, I am writing about the fact that I mentioned earlier that my mother drank while she was pregnant with me. And I'm writing about the myriad of challenges that had for me long term. So I'm a therapist, right? And it's, a lot of therapists do write their own story, but there are people that argue both sides. Yes, we need your clear voice because you are well educated and you can speak to it in ways other people cannot. And then they're like, no, therapists shouldn't disclose. So I choose not to disclose anything I haven't worked through. And that's my rule of thumb, because I don't want to disclose something that I'm still struggling with, because then I put the client in a position to try to take care of me or trigger transference more than normal. And so I worked through all of this, and in writing about it, I learned more. For example, my mother told me late in life, she said, "We never thought you would live until to be an adult. We never thought you were going to make it out of childhood." And I kind of knew that, but it was one thing to hear her say it.
Yeah.
And as I wrote, and I knew everything I wrote down, there were no surprises as far as data. Okay. So this is where quantitative research fails sometimes. I knew all the data. To see it together was changed how I saw it, because it was much more monumental than I had understood. or it validated my felt experience of it. I wrote it because there's so much ignorance and denial about a completely preventative problem of exposure to alcohol in the womb. It's as common as autism. Think about it. Children that are impacted by a maternal drinking, it's as common as autism.
And what are the effects of that?
Well, in the extreme sense, it's severe developmental disabilities and delays. I believe that alcohol in the womb triggers autoimmune challenges because I was sick so much as a child. If you think about it, it's alcohol, which is a tetragen, a poison, and it's also a sugar. And so, like I was in the hospitals a lot for pneumonia, strep throat, bronchitis. Um, so it's not a, oh, poor me story. It's it's a lot about my relationship with my mother. It's how we healed. It's how I came to a place of not only forgiving her, but loving her unconditionally. And the miracle is one of the last things my mother said to me is, I just love you bunches and bunches and bunches. Can't you feel it?
Mm.
And the other miracle is that I could. I could feel it. And that is amazing.
Mm.
And so um, I learned to set boundaries with her. Like even in the nursing home, when she would start off on her little tirades, I would just say, Mom, I'm going to be back. And sometimes I'd write a note because she was forgetful. And I'll be back tomorrow at 10 o'clock. But I'm leaving now. So I just didn't allow myself to be present for it. And it was a blessing for both of us. I I believe that maybe it helped her have a better death, and maybe it helped her have a better afterlife. And to her credit, because she had a little ego, on board. She was a debutante. She was very, very movie star beautiful. I mean, her wedding gown was lace made in a convent outside of Paris. Like, it's in the Flagler Museum in Palm Beach. Like, that was not my life.
I think I saw a photo that you
Oh,
had in the article. Yeah.
right. That's right. So, so for her to make an amends, I never expected. And she did twice. She made amends. And while my life would have been okay without it, I cherish that she was able to do that. And how and very few people have that experience. Um, and part of it was I made a choice to spend time with her, even though I probably would have rather eaten nails. I mean, seriously, it was not something that was my idea of fun, but it turned out we had fun.
Yeah.
It shocked me. We laughed a lot together. And I'm so grateful that even though she had dementia, she never forgot who I was. And her face would light up when I walked in the room. The things that I didn't happen when I was little. So some of what I know, some of what I apply to our relationship that helped heal it, I have learned from my clients by observing as they navigate complicated family relationships and their determination not just to walk away, but to heal. I have learned so much. I remember asking a client once, I think I even said it because it was so hard. He was taking care of a very abusive parent and late in life. I finally said, you don't have to do this. And he looked at me and he said, yes, I do. And I said, okay, why? He said, because it's the right thing to do. It's amazing. That kind of integrity, that kind of courage, because he was still a little boy inside of a man, dealing with a man who had been horrible to him. I think God would have forgiven if he said, "Look, I'm not doing this," but he did it,
Mm.
and he helped his father have a better end of life. That's integrity.
Yeah. And that's beautiful.
It's so beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. And inspiring.
Inspired me.
Yeah.
I mean, that his story is partly how I had the courage to take time off from work and go spend months with my mother while she was in hospice. So I'm inspired by the courage of my clients.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's a wonderful thing. And just what happens in that relationship, and that it's healing everyone.
It does. It, I feel blessed. I feel blessed that people trust me. I feel blessed that they open their hearts and their souls to me, that they have the courage to go the distance and not just come to therapy once or twice, but come over time and heal deep wounds. Um, I remember a client complaining that therapy took a long time, and I said, it does. It does. It takes way too long for everyone. I said, and to one client, I said, with your history of trauma, most people spend their lives in and out of hospitals, and you've never once been hospitalized. And so therapy takes a while, but look at the quality of your life. It's pretty remarkable for anyone, by anyone's standards.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, we're grateful and blessed for you to have
Oh,
come here and shared so much of not just what you do, but also, some of your life story and portions of it. So,
thank you.
Ericha, thank you so much for being on the Poetry Vessel podcast. It's
Delighted.
Yeah.
Thank you for asking me.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
pleasure. All right. Oh, I love having an audience. This is fun. We're going to need a bigger coffee pot. Thank you, Rachel, for filming, and Anne, thank you for having us in your house again. So
Yeah.